the Russian army is now on the path of losing its title as one of the strongest military forces in the world. Before the Ukrainian war, the Russian armed forces was considered the second-best army in the world. But the powerful Western weapons in the Ukrainian army crushed the invincible weapons of the Russian army. US-made weapons played a huge role in this success of the Ukrainian army. High-level military equipment in the inventory of the US Army was sent to Ukraine to support Kiev. The Washington administration has provided nearly $50 billion in military and humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians since the beginning of the war. A State Department data showed that Washington supplied Kiev with 1,600 Stinger anti-aircraft manpads, over 8,500 Javelin anti-tank systems, more than 700 Switchblade tactical drone systems, and 142 155mm squared howitzers. In addition, the rest of this list included in a wide range of military equipment, weapons, ammunition, and defense systems, including 36 105mm squared howitzers, 8 NASAMS air defense systems, 20 Mu-17 helicopters, and 45 T-72B tanks. In addition, the U.S. Department of Defense stated that it supplied 109 M2A2 Bradley heavy armored combat vehicles to Ukraine. A battalion M1 Abrams tank will be deployed on the Ukrainian fronts as soon as possible. These mostly American-made systems made the Ukrainian army superior to the Russian army on land. However, until now, Ukraine and Russia had not been able to achieve air dominance at the front. For this, the Ukrainian administration demanded powerful warplanes and air defense systems from the USA and the West. Ukrainian cities were still not fully protected against Russian missile retaliation. For this, the USA, UK, France, and Germany sent their powerful air defense systems to the Ukrainian army. Air defense systems such as NASAMS, IRIS, and Krytal have achieved a success rate of more than 95% against Russian missiles and UAVs. However, there was still no solution against Russia's hypersonic missiles. For this reason, the Kiev administration requested Patriot air defense systems from Washington. The Patriot air defense system has proven itself in many areas, but it has not fought against hypersonic missiles until now. While Moscow despised the Patriot air defense systems, the Ukrainian people placed high hopes on the Patriots. It recently achieved a historic success against the Russian army's most successful hypersonic missiles and warplanes. Russia launched a wave of missile and drone strikes in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, a day after 2 drones exploded near the Kremlin in Moscow. After a series of serial airstrikes and explosions in Russian cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Crimea, Krasnodar, Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk, last week, the Russian army carried out the heaviest missile strike of the war on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine's Western air defense successfully destroyed Russian kamikaze UAVs and missiles. The Russian army relied heavily on hypersonic missiles, but Patriot air defense systems proved to be the god of war. It was quite remarkable that the Russian Air Force used 47 missiles in its attacks in Kiev. This Kinzhal missile was fired from Russian soil by a MiG-31 of the Russian Air Force, but most of these Russian attacks were blocked by the Ukrainian air defense. Ukrainian forces recently confirmed that they had successfully shot down a Russian 47-meter-squared Kinzhal hypersonic missile over Kiev. The blocking of Kinzhal by the US-designed MIM-104 Patriot surface-to-air missile system created a bombshell effect. In other words, the US-made Patriot air defense system used by the Ukrainian armed forces has accomplished the impossible by shooting down the Russians' invincible missile Kinzhal. The US-made Patriot air defense system achieved a first in history with its 100% success and hit rate against Russian hypersonic missile systems. This shocking news clarified earlier conflicting reports about whether one of the cutting-edge weapons had been destroyed. The announcement was made by the Ukrainian Air Force commander, Lieutenant General Mykola Oleszczuk, who described the event as a historical event on the social media platform Telegram. If you remember, Putin, speaking when he introduced the council, claimed that the missile was unstable to air defense systems. Of course, having such a missile provides serious advantages in the field of armed struggle. The power of this missile, as military experts say, can be enormous, and its speed makes it vulnerable to today's missile defense and air defense systems. But the Patriots, the U.S. air defense system used by the Ukrainian armed forces, completely broke this taboo. Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Ignat stated that the downing of Kinzhal was a slap in the face to Russia. After the downing of its most powerful missiles, the general situation and course of the Russian Air Force began to seriously come to the fore. Russian pilots failed to take much action to support their troops on the ground due to poor training and outdated equipment, according to a report by the top British think tank Royal United Services Institute. The report, released this week, outlined the strengths and weaknesses of Russia's Air Force in Ukraine based on a series of interviews with intelligence services, military experts, and Ukrainian Air Force commanders. Since Russia first invaded in February of last year, it was already known that one of its biggest failures in Ukraine was the failure of its pilots to provide dynamic, close air support to Russian units on the battlefield. But recent war reports have resurfaced. This situation supporting Russian ground troops required Russian pilots to fly at very low altitudes, according to the report. But very few Russian fixed-wing pilots had significant training or money for very low altitude, close air support in disputed airspace, because this training in the basic Russian Air Force before the invasion never formed part of the duties of the Russian army. On top of that, it was clear that some Russian aircraft had known shortcomings with various sensors and weapons that did not allow them to effectively hit their targets. That is, Russia has not invested heavily in sensors, weapons, and pilot training, which the Western Air Force has acknowledged. After decades of anti-insurgency campaigns where air power provides most of the deployed joint force firepower, the Russian Air Force has not had success since the start of its invasion, mostly due to the flexibility of Ukraine's surface-to-air defense systems. It largely defended Ukraine's skies with its own systems until October 2022. But now, with Western-supplied weapons and defense systems, including U.S. Patriot and Stinger missiles, Ukrainian forces have largely secured their security. But despite all this, it is known that Russia has a significant number of aircraft in its inventory, and there is a lot of capacity left. Therefore, all countries should act in cooperation to give Ukraine as much air defense capability as possible. On the other hand, while Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues so badly with both the successful steps of the Ukrainian forces and the support of the U.S. Western Europe to Kiev, some striking speculations continue to surround Russia, especially after Russia's downing of Kinzhal missiles with Patriot systems used by Ukrainian forces. Rumors began to leak that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be overthrown with a close coup. The growing popularity of the war, combined with a sinking economy and the staggering death toll, helped fuel the idea that Putin would be forced out of power. According to military analysts, a coup d'état becomes a real possibility when the political situation changes and the country has a truly unpopular president at its head and war is really undesirable. In fact, no clear information was shared to prove this situation, but Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine did not go well. In addition to the suffering inflicted on Ukraine, Russia has unleashed a number of natural problems upon itself. From a military, economic, and geopolitical point of view, the occupation deteriorated Russia's stance. It also profoundly changed the geopolitical landscape facing Moscow in Europe. Similarly, Russian equipment was destroyed. Estimates show that Russia has lost more than 9,000 combat vehicles, namely tanks and armored personnel carriers. And Russia's aggression has resulted in international condemnation, which is manifested in economic sanctions. The result was that the Russian economy was pushed into recession. In addition to the material damage suffered by Russia, this invasion decision also damaged the reputation of Moscow and Putin. And this situation has become a pariah in the eyes of the international community. It will take years, if not decades, to overcome the hostility that the war has generated against Russia due to international backlash. So given the disastrous outcome of the invasion so far, the environment is understandably ripe for coup d'état speculation. However, the probability of a coup still seems low, especially given that Putin is aware of the possibility. Last year, Putin fired more than 100 Federal Security Bureau agents to send a very strong message to those who oppose the war in Ukraine. Similarly, Putin placed the former leader of Russia's Fifth Service under house arrest. You can expect Putin to continue to take steps to reduce the likelihood of a coup. So for now, there is no change in power in Moscow. Maybe Putin can leave power when Russia has no more bullets to shoot than lose a very powerful missile like the console. But then everything would be too late for Russia. There are a lot of updates from Sudan. The Wagner mercenaries that are responsible for storming Soledar received an order to storm the city non-stop. After a series of major unsuccessful advances, the Russians immediately made another attack, which caught everyone by surprise because they launched in between 3 Ukrainian fighter positions. Such a risky move has already cost them an extremely high casualty rate because the attacks are so intense that the surrounding area is scattered with bodies, forcing them to walk around them or step over because no break is given to collect them. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack in the southern part of the city and successfully pushed the Wagner forces from the Artyom Sol tourist area. After that, the front line stabilized in this region, and even though the fights in the vicinity are still taking place, no changes have been registered here. I also told you that the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack in the eastern part of the city. Today, the information regarding this attack was clarified, and it turned out that it happened in the northeastern part of the city in a series of Russian assaults along the perimeter of Soledar. The Russians managed to establish a toehold in the northern part of the residential area. After that, they tried to move inside the city and cut the Ukrainians off from the northwest. But the latest updates suggest that as a result of the Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians were pushed back towards the outskirts while the Ukrainians concentrated their forces and attention to the north and south of the settlement. The Russians threw another attack feast right in the center. Ukrainian Deputy Minister described the latest developments in Solidarity and said that after an unsuccessful attempt to capture Solidarity and retreat from the northern and southern areas, the enemy regrouped and launched a powerful assault. Other officials said that the Wagner forces did not regroup and just deployed a large number of new assault groups formed from the best reserves of the Wagners. It is still unclear where exactly the Wagners managed to slip through. As you remember, the Ukrainians established their positions on the eastern outskirts. The area between this eastern outskirts and the salt mines should also be closed because there is a lake and a dense tree area. From the information available right now, it seems like the Ukrainians have fixed Ukrainian troops to the north and east and slipped through the gardens. It looks like the Ukrainians assumed that they had enough control over the region by controlling the tall buildings to the north and countryside to the east. So this gap in between remained less protected. If this is indeed the case, then it was a huge mistake on the part of the Ukrainians. The Wagners conducted an extremely risky move because they basically put themselves in a crossfire. The Wagners entered this small blocks, which are basically in between the tall residential area salt mines and the countryside. This move just shows how much risk the Wagners are forced to take. It was said that the Wagners received an order to keep up the momentum of continuous assaults and advance at all costs. And with almost 40,000 prisoners used as cannon fodder, they can clearly afford it. Local footage indicates that there was simply no time to remove the bodies. So the Wagners are literally advancing over the corpses of their soldiers that were killed in the previous waves of assaults. The Russians have heavily concentrated their artillery fire and air strikes in this region, which allowed the Wagners to enter the city from the east. Interestingly, some Ukrainian officials also reported that the Russians did not expect to enter the outskirts so quickly, so they suffered the fire from their own artillery. Previously, we observed something similar in Opeten, the Wagners push incredibly intensely up until the breaking point. Then they suddenly stop as their combat capability has been undermined. Overall, Solder has become the center of attention of both armies after the failed attempt to take Bakhmut in front. The Wagner forces got a chance to prove that they could take cities in solidarity. The head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, is likely trying to capitalize on the tactical retreat from the eastern outskirts that the Ukrainians conducted a week ago. The goals here are to use the momentum and psychological pressure to force the Ukrainians to retreat, because in this case he can take the credit for every meter that they capture. That is why the Wagners received an order to storm the city non-stop, and that is why they are using extremely risky tactics. If the Ukrainians manage to withstand these attacks and continue to conduct their counterattacks timely, the Wagners will burn their reserves and will have to decrease the intensity of their attacks very soon. Dozens of developments are taking place every day in the Russia-Ukraine war. The war continues with losses and gains, explosions, operations, attacks destroyed, bases retreating and surrendering soldiers. When you say the list goes on, when we look at this list in general, there is a clear fact. This fact is now being noticed by the whole world. Yes, we are talking about the fact that Russia has suffered a major setback since the day it started its occupation of Ukraine. Even Putin is aware of this fact, so much so that Putin is trying to eliminate this reality with many different plans. But almost every decision Putin has taken or plan he has implemented has failed. With the loss of more than 110,000 military personnel and tons of ammunition, Putin does not know what to do anymore. Russia has had a bad start to 2023. Ukraine, on the other hand, made history in the first days of the new year. In the last months of 2022, the war intensified on the eastern and southern fronts. The smoke rising over these regions continues to appear in the sky. Fierce clashes are taking place, especially in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast and the cities connected to these regions. Putin has been trying to seize these important Ukrainian regions, but without success. In the first week of the new year, Putin targeted Ukraine with several new plans, but these plans completely turned against Putin and the Russian army with a strategic move. The Ukrainian army foiled almost all of Russia's plans. Dozens of Russian tanks and missiles were destroyed by the Ukrainian Air Force. Before detailing this important Ukrainian operation, let's talk about Putin's plans. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is making moves to move the fighting on the Ukrainian border into Ukraine. That's why the fighting has intensified in the town of Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast, through the city and Lemon and other cities in Donetsk Oblast. Putin plans to expand into Ukrainian territory for the same reason fighting has intensified in the town of Kremenny, Luhansk Oblast. The Russian army and mercenaries are attacking these areas. However, the Ukrainian army's successful counterattacks have thwarted almost all of Russia's attacks. Another plan of Putin is to open the door to the invasion of Ukraine from Belarus. To realize this idea, Putin held a meeting with his Belarusian counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko, in the last days of 2022. This meeting was interpreted in the press as follows: Putin seeks Belarusian help for the invasion of Ukraine. After the meeting, Lukashenko said, "If you want peace, get really ready for war. Neither I nor you invented it." Lukashenko's statement confirmed the media interpretation of Putin's meeting with Belarus, but there was one point that Putin ignored. Ukraine was getting stronger day by day with the help of dozens of Western and European countries against Russia, which was asking for help from one country. Ukraine is showing this strength by upsetting Putin's plans. Another plan Putin has in mind is to discourage the resistance of the Ukrainian people against the occupation. With this in mind, Putin is carrying out a series of attacks on civilian areas. Although these attacks are aimed at breaking the morale and motivation of the Ukrainian people, Putin has not succeeded. After each Russian attack, the Ukrainian people show stronger resistance against the invaders. The people and the army are increasing their support for President Zelensky. Every day, Russia, which cannot succeed with its soldiers on the front line, cannot succeed in its attempts to break the morale and motivation of the Ukrainian people. We have already discussed Russian leader Vladimir Putin's unsuccessful plans to prevent the setback of the invasion. Now we can discuss in detail the extraordinary offensive of the Ukrainian army that will go down in history. In the first days of the new year, Russia moved to reinforce its positions in the town of Kremenny, Luhansk Oblast. Military personnel and equipment were increased in this area, but the Russian army did not know that it was under Ukrainian civilians. Ukrainian intelligence units are watching Russia's almost every step. Ukraine, therefore, had some information about the preparations in Kremlin. Russia's preparations were complete and missile attacks on Ukraine had begun. But there was an unexpected development. The Ukrainian Air Force had deployed air defense systems in several areas to destroy Russian missiles aimed at the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. With the activation of these systems, the Ukrainian skies turned into an iron dome. All missiles launched by Russian troops were destroyed by Ukrainian air defense systems. The Russian military. He was stunned by what happened. Now it was you. Please turn to attack. Having successfully destroyed the Russian missiles, the Ukrainian army targeted the occupying positions and bases in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, where the fighting intensified in the first week of the new year. Hundreds of explosions took place in the areas where Russian troops are located. One of the most important of these explosions was an ambush by the Ukrainian army targeting a Russian tank platoon. Ukrainian troops had set up an ambush in key areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. HIMARS missile systems and artillery systems were also deployed in these areas. Unaware of this ambush, the Russian army was passing through the area where Ukrainian soldiers and equipment were deployed with their tanks. The platoon, with dozens of tanks, was expected to be targeted by Ukrainian soldiers with missiles and artillery systems. The attack was launched. Missiles and artillery systems were fired at the Russian tank platoon as the missiles and artillery hit the Russian tanks. Flames rose from the occupied territories. Russian tanks exploded one by one. Russia's great loss was evident in the fireballs that appeared in the sky. A few days after this operation, images of the incident were shared on social media. In the images shared, it is seen that dozens of destroyed Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers are being withdrawn from the area by Ukrainian soldiers. But there is a striking fact in these images. This fact belongs to the claims that Russian tanks and armored vehicles have been exhausted. In the footage, it was revealed that the tanks and armored personnel carriers were Soviet air vehicles. For example, the Soviet-made BTR-80 armored personnel carrier was clearly visible in the shared videos. Russia's loss of military personnel and equipment is increasing every day. If Putin cannot prevent this increase, he may lose against Ukraine because the Ukrainian armed forces recently made a statement on this issue. According to the statement, Russia has only a few missiles left to attack. The Ukrainian armed forces stated that this is why Putin has reduced his missile attacks, and if this continues, he will be able to carry out much fewer missile attacks after March. It is not known what Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who is getting exhausted day by day but does not give up his decision to invite for his own personal interests, not those of his country, will do in the coming days. Ukrainian leader Zelensky, on the other hand, is making history with the support of Western and European countries. The war will seem to intensify in 2023. How do you evaluate the successful offensive of the Ukrainian army? What will Russia do now that it has regressed against Ukraine? Will Putin be able to solve the problem of troops and ammunition?